Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today's video is going to be about long-lived characters in the Malazan universe. Before I get started, this will contain references to, if not explicit details of characters, but I wouldn't want anyone to be spoiled. So treat this more as spoilers for the whole series, even though I'm not going to be doing an in-depth analysis of plot points or specific characters, but I will be referencing information about them that is not necessarily available at the beginning of the series. So treat this as spoilers for the whole series. If that means that you're not going to watch any further, thank you for watching thus far, and I hope to catch you in another video. But for everyone else, let's get started. So this came up, and I'm just going to bring up a note here. This came up because there was a gentleman by the name of Richard Sorba had posted on the Malazan Empire Facebook group about the concept of long-lived characters, and posted both a weakness of the Malazan Book of the Fallen in how Erikson treats these incredibly long-lived characters, as well as a strength of how Erikson treats these incredibly long-lived characters. And I thought it was a really interesting point that he made. So interesting, in fact, that I wanted to make a video about it. And I apologize for paraphrasing his argument. He may mean it in a slightly different way. But what I understood of him saying is these characters who are incredibly long-lived, they will continue to evolve. Their perception of reality will continue to evolve, so much so that communication between mere mortals, like the humans, like us, and these beings would become incredibly difficult, because these beings would be so alien that there's no point of connection anymore. And as a way of illustrating this, he drew the analogy to how the human mind changes from when you're first born to when you become an adult. In that, when we are initially born and our eyes are closed, the world does not exist. When we are looking at things as a little tiny baby, that is the universe. And when our eyes are covered, the universe has ceased to exist. And that's because tiny babies do not understand the concept of object permanence. And that's when, you hide something from them and then you bring it back and they get all shocked. And it's because it's suddenly reappeared. You caused it to cease to exist and then you've just brought it back. It's also why sometimes when you're playing with the baby and they're all happy and you walk out of view, suddenly they start crying. And it's because you have ceased to exist to them because they can no longer see you. And it's only when you step back into view that suddenly you've sprung back into existence again. And we see this cognitive development over time as children learn to understand that the world continues to exist even when they are not present. That then they start to understand that what they know is not necessarily the same as what you know. And then we see this development where children start to lie and they tell the most outrageous, stupid lies that no one would believe, because they don't understand that we have a significant source of knowledge and perception of things that they don't. And then this carries on until people realize that, yes, I have my perspective of what's going on. You have your perspective of what's going on. We may have a different background knowledge. We may have different things that we are aware of, and we can view the same event, but we may view it very differently. And this is a foundational principle, obviously, of empathy and tied into compassion. That the ability to imagine yourself in someone else's shoes, to imagine yourself in their position, is a skill that we learn. It is not intrinsic, and it's a skill that has to be developed, because so often we assume that if we see something one way, then surely everyone is going to see it that way. And it can be quite a shock sometimes when you think that something is incredibly obvious and everyone looks at you like you have three heads and going, what the hell are you talking about? Try being the person coming out of a film going, that film was terrible. And everyone else around you is going, what are you talking about? That was an amazing film. And then imagine the looks on their faces when I absolutely destroy all of the film for them by pointing out all of the things that went wrong. Um, yeah, I don't get invited to the cinema anymore. But Richard made this argument, and it's a really interesting argument that the idea that a character who has lived for hundreds of thousands of years, why haven't they continued to evolve? Why hasn't their perception of reality altered really significantly? And if you think about it, it's a very core question, and it's a very good question, because if we think of how we perceive time, time to us is very much finite, that there's only a certain amount of it. Time is precious because we do not have an unlimited amount. And we carve up chunks of time, measurements of time. But if time is almost infinite, does it still have the same value? If we think of someone who has lived for 300,000 years, and you say, right, we need to do this thing, it's going to take about a week to build. That's a long time of us all working on this, and it's going to take a week. And they're looking at it from the perspective of someone who's 300,000 years old going, but a week, that's not particularly long. That's a tiny amount of time. It's, I have built this house. This house is going to last for 100 years, which to us, relatively long period of time. The person who's 100,000 years old, oh, did you not want to build something more permanent? That someone who has that perception of time that is so much grander than ours, so much bigger than ours, that must, in some ways, shape their perception of reality. And it is fascinating. And Erikson has said about certain characters that he didn't want to use their perspective because he thought their perspective would be so alien that it would be very hard, not only for him to write, but for the reader to understand. It is very difficult for us, because of how we perceive the universe, to truly imagine an alien perspective. And it's even more difficult, if we can imagine it, to then communicate that. So in a lot of narratives, in a lot of fantasy, there is this conceit that even if someone is hundreds of thousands of years old, that they still will act pretty much like humans. They won't change. They will still think of minutes and hours and days and weeks and months, that they still perceive time in that very human way, even if their lifespan is for eons. So I think that's an interesting point. But where I disagree with Richard's point is this idea that just because someone lasts for hundreds of thousands of years, that they would continue to evolve. And I think one of the interesting things in the Malazan world is so many of these incredibly long-lived characters have an intervening event which potentially has interfered with this evolution. So if we take as the first most obvious example, the Talan Imas. As the Imas, obviously as a mortal race, started out as babies, grew through adolescence, became the warriors and bone casters and had a society. But when they go through the ritual of Talan, there is an intervening act, and that act severs them from the mortal experience. It stops them evolving. Now, this is entirely conjecture on my part. It's my sort of way of trying to think around these concepts that Richard brought up. But I'm thinking of the ritual of Talan as something that is severing them. Yes, they have a physical body now, but the body no longer grows. The body no longer sort of changes organically and can evolve. Their minds then are locked into that perspective when they suddenly became Talan Imas from Imas. And they lose the ability then for things to change for them. That That moment of change is basically where they end up, and that's the end of it. Evolutionary dead tree, dead branch. They are not going any further. There's not going to be any change. And then we think of someone like the Teist Andy, and you go, yeah, but they're not undead. They don't have this intervening act. But we do have Mother Dark turning away from them, that the spiritual essence that all of these other mortals have, that we're connected to these divine planes or spiritual planes, that you don't necessarily have to be a follower of that specific deity, but these things exist, that there's a spiritual element to our souls, our consciousness, that when the mortals of this world die, they go to Hood's realm. There is a spiritual component. But for the Teist, the Andy at least, Mother Dark turned her back, turned away, severed that connection. So although they continue, they do not necessarily live. That an aspect of their being has been removed, stunted, denied, blocked away, because Mother Dark has turned her regard away from them. So again, an intervening act that could potentially, within the universe, explain why the Teist don't learn, don't evolve beyond where they currently are. They are locked into a cycle of just existing. If we think then of Calor, Calor is a fascinating example. For all intents and purposes, a human king and emperor, and he laid waste to an entire continent because he was a dictator. But Calor, you go, where's the intervening act there? He is cursed by three elder gods. And in the moment of that curse, where they deny him his ability to ascend, we could view that moment of him being cursed as this moment that is separating and stunting any potential true organic growth, either of consciousness or of spiritual awareness, of anything other than continuing to exist and continuing to age. So we again have this intervening act. But let's turn to the Jagat. The Jagat, if we ignore undead Jagat and that various sort of thing, but think of the Jagat, who, yes, they are incredibly long-lived. Some of them have lived for hundreds of thousands of years. But one of the interesting things about the Jagat is they turn their back on society, on civilization, on mixing with other people. And therefore, through their own isolation, have stagnated, have not evolved, have not been exposed to new ideas, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things, that they're, from the moment that they isolate themselves, that's it. They get locked into that, because even if they continue to experience the herbs in their garden growing or trees rising and falling, there are no new thoughts, no new ways of thinking and conceiving the world, because they are so withdrawn. They don't have this influx and importation of other ideas, other ways of perceiving reality to help them grow. And we see that when cultures mix, that we learn from each other. Sometimes we learn the wrong things from each other. But there is a learning, growth, change process when different peoples mix, when different technologies are made known, when different modes of thought and academic ways of framing arguments, they help us learn and grow. But the Jagat separate themselves from that. We also have other characters who die, and in the sense that their physical bodies are destroyed, but they may have ascended. They may have gone to the divine plane and assumed godhood. And of course, like we can think of Kellenved and Dancer in this regards, that even if they didn't physically die, they ascended. And now they've become the patron of assassins and Shadow Throne, this god of shadow. But when we think of a lot of the deities in various mythologies, they are aspected. And so when they take on that aspect, can they grow beyond it? Can they be more than their aspect? Because if Kellamved has embraced being Shadow Throne and being this almost god of shadow, can he ever be more than the god of shadow? Or is that now going to eventually wear away his human ability to learn, his human ability to think differently, and he will be forever locked into what that abstract notion of shadow is? And I know, one of the counterexamples is yes, but we have these gods that do learn new things within the series. Kamensot being a perfect example, or even Krull. And what I find interesting about those examples is Krull and Kamensot were very much locked into a way of thinking until they became physically embodied and started mixing with humans. And while they were physically embodied, while they were made manifest in the mortal realm, they were more vulnerable. They did not have access to all of their power. And they then start to be exposed to experiences that help them learn, so that when they become their full divine figure again, that has shaped their experience. So I'm not saying that there's a complete watertight argument here. These are really interesting and fascinating ways to think about the alien nature of these beings, and ways that maybe we can rationalize or explain why they aren't functioning the way that maybe we think they should. But again, I will come back to the point that one of the great strengths of this, and it's something that Richard highlighted, is that this is a very deliberate artistic choice by Erikson to emphasize the empathy, to emphasize to emphasize the compassion, to emphasize the fact that we need to start seeing the similarities in each other instead of seeing the differences. And because that narrative focus is always bringing us closer together, is always trying to show us how we are like others and not emphasizing our differences and how we are unlike others, this is a very deliberate choice on Erikson's part to help us empathize, to help us find compassion, that we start thinking in terms of how are we like, not what are our differences. So I hope you've enjoyed that slightly rambling discussion. It is an absolutely fascinating concept, and there's lots more to talk about in terms of long live races, particularly in terms of language and culture. There are all sorts of narrative conceits and things that we accept in narrative just so we can get on with the story. And they are very common across science fiction and fantasy. So this is not the be all and end all of this conversation, but I was so impressed by what Richard was bringing up about this, about cognitive development, that's why I wanted to do this. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.